Hi, folks. I'm Adrian Sanabria, the host of Enterprise Security Weekly. Every week, we interview the most interesting folks we can find, talking about the most pressing cybersecurity issues and challenges facing the enterprise today. Myself and my co-hosts have each been in the industry for decades, long enough to see the patterns in the industry and explore where trends are going. In addition to enterprise challenges, we also follow the vendor space, the most interesting security startups emerging, technology and product trends, all the most interesting funding and acquisition announcements. Finally, we love to discuss the latest trends in tech and how they'll impact cybersecurity. If you're wondering how the latest in AI, quantum computing, cloud, and DevOps is going to impact security a few years down the road, you should follow the Enterprise Security Weekly podcast.
Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Tyler Von Moll about starting cybersecurity programs with small orgs, and he was a pretty optimistic guy. So application security is most likely to succeed. We'll see. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella and Akira Brand. We've got the news coming up, but first, an announcement. Security Weekly listeners save $100 on their RSA Conference 2024 Full Conference Pass. RSA Conference will take place May 6th through 9th here in San Francisco and on demand. To register using our discount code, visit securityweekly.com/RSAC24. Use the code 54USU SecWeekly. It's on the webpage. Don't worry if I flubbed it there. We hope to see you there. And I thought we would, I'm really going to push this idea of limericks are going to be the new way that we do all of our cybersecurity awareness training. So I thought I'd kick us off with one about, from a programmer's perspective. So bear with me real quick. A programmer refused to admit that reviews help improve a commit. They used syntax so cursed and submitted the worst, and that's why all their code looked like Perl. And that is my setup for a lot of vulnerabilities in code this week. We've got two articles about safe locks. One, I'm going to kind of tie them together. One from ZDNet talking about secret backdoor codes, which aren't necessarily secret, or they're secret because they're not fully disclosed or not as transparently disclosed to end users that this feature exists. And then another one about a list of vulnerabilities in another smart lock that honestly just reads like basic, secure design problems 101. So it is talking about downgrading encryption. You can do this. So it's sort of, my question comes, how can you have a lock that establishes an unencrypted connection in the first place? Why in this day and age is that even possible, let alone the downgrade? It's also talking about, keys, virtual keys are deleted from the client that you might share with others, accessing the lock, but they're not deleted from the lock itself. Again, you don't need this secret anymore. Why isn't just deleted everywhere? So my mind is immediately going to these as examples of bad design rather than just picking on the vulnerabilities themselves. And I don't know, John, I can't remember if you have some locks that you've played with yourself, but I know the IoT space is some good physical hands-on stuff that you always appreciate playing with.
Yeah, so this is a topic I personally don't screw around with, at least if it's something I'm actually going to use, not just, pick one up off eBay to research on. If it's something I'm going to use, I don't go with some brand I've never heard of before. I'm looking for a big major brand that has like a lot of money behind them that can either hire the right company to do this right or build that IoT team and figure out how to do it and actually take physical security seriously. Off the top of my head, two names come to mind, Yale and Slage. Slage has issues because they won't go and open their API, so I'm moving away from them. But but what you're not hearing me say is, in general, I'm not a big fan of the various startups which are doing these locks because that's cool. You can put it on your apartment door, but and some of them have done testing. Some of these guys have actually now over the last 4 or 5 years gone and done the thing to make these secure. But a lot of them are some dude who's like, hey, I'm going to make an IoT lock and it's going to fit in my door. And he puts it up on Kickstarter, sells 10,000 of them, and they never even think about anything. This particular one on the CMU article, can you imagine this coming? If this was actually a blog post from like any security vendors we usually talk about that do like R&D, this would just be slaughtering this vendor, because if you look at the list of things they have in here, it's really incredible. So if you hit up their website I was doing earlier, they've got a list of. So this company, Schneider, not Schneider, the North American electronic vendor. Electrical vendor. This is different. SCIENER. They're basically they've created a series of locks plus the software to run them, and then it looks like they're white labeling or something sort of standard. It's a Chinese vendor. I don't care about the Chinese part, but it's one of those vendors which they've making these things cheaply and they're selling them off to other people. I'm guessing you're probably going to find them in large hotels, particularly since they have hotel software managing these locks in hotels. So yeah, that type of thing where it's not that big a deal for me to spend 100 or 200 on a lock, right? Because I've got one of those in my house that's outside. Probably, maybe, I'll let you guys guess. But compare that to like a hotel where each floor has like 50 of these locks, where you suddenly start caring about the price per door. But the downside of that is we end up with a blog post like this, which is pretty horrible. I sort of a list of things not to do. Go ahead, Akira.
No, I was going to say, like, this is something that is bringing up a topic to mind that we also sort of talked about with Tyler, which is what is the ethics of when you release a product, right? Like, when is secure enough?
I think we've talked about this show before. I've talked about a friend who I've gotten into heated arguments around this. I don't think those, particularly the startups, but I don't know about this particular company. I think frequently it's not, I wouldn't say it's unethical because I don't think they have the slightest idea what wrongs they're doing. So there's probably some cases out there where they're like, yeah, it's not secure, but by the time someone finds out, we'll have sold 100,000 of them and we'll just close and open a new business. I don't think it's that. So to me, I wouldn't go down the ethical path. I mean, the other side of that ethics is for that hotel chain or maybe a one-off that is putting in an order for 1,000 of these. Are they caring, or are they just saying, well, if something happens, our insurance will cover it?
Right.
So yeah, it's something to consider, but I think very few people in the AppSec space, I think very few people who are touching something AppSec related are doing it out of unethical means.
Beautiful.
And it's a great way to bring in the other reason I pulled in these two articles is the FCC Cyber Trust Mark. So they are now, this was work that they announced back in August of 2023, which is, here are some ways that we're going to say that IoT devices, wireless IoT devices, have been reviewed to a degree of security. And now they're going to get a logo applied to them. And this week, FCC has just adopted that and is going to go forward. So one way to touch on specifically what you were mentioning, Akira, would be, a unethical actor, vendor throwing on this mark when it's unearned and just saying, oh yeah, we've got a cyber trust mark. Look, we're secure. But I wanted to also go back to something that John said. You mentioned, for example, looking at for your own use, that sense of trust. If you see this nice, pretty FCC logo, how much trust does that improve for you when you're doing your shopping?
I think that we need to disseminate this information. Otherwise, consumers aren't going to know. And kind of a similar problem could crop up that we have with the labels of organic or earth friendly, where there's the whole concept of greenwashing, where a company truly will make it seem like the product is earth friendly when in fact it's not. And I would say that we are going to have some of that kerfuffle in this space. But I'm curious, John, what you think.
I think my mute button's working. I'm muting my joke that I had for that. But I think it's the way I think about this is, and again, I think we hit upon this at some point in the last few years, is if you think about the Energy
Star?
Yeah, thank you. This is a U.S. comment, so for our outsiders, for those outside the U.S., excuse me, there's a marketing program here from one of the government branches called Energy Star, and you'll see the little logo on a refrigerator or probably pretty much anything nowadays, electronics, even on buildings too, about how green is this? Is it using energy efficiently, or is it basically a heater inside your refrigerator, right? That's sort of one example. I don't think I think there's some sophisticated customers out there who go looking for and specifically trying to buy like an Energy Star highly rated TV as an example. I think the general people who see that like go, that's just something I need to go and take that stupid sticky thing off my TV because it's going to leave marks behind. And it's probably going to be the exact same here with the AppSec stuff, right? Or excuse me, the what are they calling this? The cyber trust mark. I was just looking at their website and they've got like a few different examples of it. They're not really saying what the marks are going to mean or do yet. They're just saying, hey, we want to do this. So, okay, it'll probably be like Wi-Fi and like, we'll start getting all sorts of different versions of 6, 6A, 6G, whatever else. So we'll see how it goes over time. I like the idea. And when it first came out, I've done talks on something similar to this for CNCF. There's the standards in Europe are probably about 6 to 10 months ahead of what we got here in the US. So in general, I like this idea of having some sort of like thing that goes in a package saying this is safe. The question is, will they actually go that far? Will they have something sort of washed out?
It's definitely something we'll have to throw into our 6 months later list, John and Akira, because indeed, to Kira, to your point, they say that they'll have a QR code you can scan. You can go and look at an updated website that has a list of what is the latest Vuln information about this. But a little bit what I think John was alluding to: how many people will care? How influential is that? It will be nice to see, though, that they'll have some type of compliance testing by accredited labs, as they say, as part of this program. But one of the things would come to me is in this signer example, this smart lock from this article from CMU, a lot of these Vulns pointed to underlying secure design issues. I'm worried less about an implementation error and worried more about this is just bad design approach and how would a mark be handled in this situation. So a bit of a rhetorical question, but one that I'm very curious to watch and see how this evolves. Sorry, I'm running out of words today over time.
One last comment on this before we move on is, as you were talking through it, I don't know, something about the words you said hit the manager part of my brain that worries about costs and stuff. And another way to look at this is how much it's going to cost me if I'm selling IoT things or building IoT things, okay, now I need to go and get certified by some security vendor for those. Is that like another 5,000, 10,000, 50,000? So it's, and that's one way or another, we have to have some way of authenticating that, hopefully, not just allowing people to self-sign, but, or then you're going to have someone putting like fake stickers on the boxes too. So that's going to be fun to watch. And let's come back in 6 months.
Let's come back in 6 months. Indeed. There's a whole bunch of other stuff I want to do. Switching from IoT, let's go to the web a little bit. And our friend ZAP has now a new home. They were at OWASP, and we talked throughout 2023. OWASP went through some things, some drama, to use with a capital D, just about losing ZAP. But they're still, of course, on friendly terms. Simon Bennett is still doing OWASP projects. So it's not a drama that is for the sake of the gossip pages. It's more of just where is the focus? How is it funded? ZAP went over to OpenSSF, but OpenSSF lost that funding dried up, to use the phrase from their blog post. And now they're over a crash override, which I thought was pretty interesting, just because they're using a different model, or they're focusing on these types of projects that they want to give homes to and support with, in money specifically. I don't know. That's more of a FYI. Yeah, go ahead, John.
I think it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out, because what we saw last year from Crash Override is, and it might have been just very well planned and executed, but the length of time between when they first sort of appeared on the map with, what was it, Chalk, and when they actually had the first version out, was like, it seemed like they executed on that really quickly. So is that sort of get up and go, I'll say? Is that going to, how's that going to affect ZAP? Is that going to allow them to do faster development cycles or maybe have more resources? I think that'll be interesting to see what happens over the next, again, our standard 6 months.
I also wonder, how Crash Override is going to start prioritizing different features, like in the ZAP roadmap, or if they're going to be completely hands-off, or if it's something somewhere in the middle. Do you guys know?
So let's find out. We'll have Mark Curfey come on in a couple of weeks, and we can ask him directly. That would be even great. Great. We'll also find out, because I'm also curious what other projects, what are projects like ZAP that are, and I'll frame it this way, that are worth investing in because they're delivering value rather than just open source tools that are fun or one-off but aren't supported in a long term or aren't going to be supported in the long term. But let's jump around with some other vulns. Let's skip over to, actually, we're thinking, we've got some deep thoughts. What if the OS was a database? Yeah, let's get us thinking.
So I found this in my browsing over the weekend. Interesting idea. So the premise here at the base of this article over on Next Platform is there's a startup behind this, but I don't think this is a sponsored piece or anything. It's just found it sort of interesting. So the general concepts, if you think about modern computes, either high performance computing or cloud computing or machine learning, a lot of these type of things, you're dealing with crazy scale, right? So it's not uncommon to really. I think one of the examples they had in this, just when they were doing R&D on this, they fired up a cluster of 1,000 nodes at AWS. Or you can do this to any cloud providers. I remember when Red Hat was testing out Kubernetes scaling, probably about 5-6 years ago, they were building 10,000 node clusters just to see how it worked. So you can imagine in the real world how this stuff is getting used is there's large clusters. And the point around this is, how do you do, and this is partially the reason Kubernetes came into popularity, is how do you do automation and scaling and tracking of really jobs in like large scale when you've got like thousands of nodes, terabytes of RAM, thousands, if not tens of thousands of CPU cores. This is a really large problem, right? And so take that back and think about your standard Unix or even Windows. These operating systems, they're just not designed to keep track of that many different things, right? You don't have that many FIFOs. You don't have that many open files or open listeners, right? These type of things. That scale just doesn't exist. Or did that job complete, or was it failed, or did something happen, or did the node go down, or all these type of things is why you see, Kubernetes or Docker Swarm or all these, we've got like years of these different types of orchestration systems. So the concept which these fine fellows came up with was they happened to be in a room with giving a talk on this type of thing with the man who has created multiple databases, including Ingress, Postgres, a few others from, I believe, UC Berkeley. So the idea there was, we realized this is a problem. So instead of trying to keep state on the OS, we're keeping state on the my camera's suddenly deciding it wants to go and fall on my face where it's not. I'm sorry. To keep state in a database, and like we're just going to use the database itself and like have that be where we do this. And the comment where they went from that is like, well, why do we need an operating system? If the operating system is designed for files and networking, all these type of things, which is a scale we're not working at, how about we just remove that out of the way, have the database be the core basic principle, and then run our quote unquote programs on top of that. So that's the idea. And they're using a distributed database, what they started with. I want to say it's ZeroDB. It's an open source database where it's got the concepts of distribution in there and locking and larger scale and how do you sync across and electing leaders and all those type of things. So that's sort of the core of it. And then right now for any jobs or schedules and things like that, they're actually writing it in TypeScript, which sits on top. It's a NoSQL database. So the authors of this post would thought it'd be really fun if they did it pure SQL. Then you could have like SQL statements or programs to actually go in that be running in your operating system, which is a little mind-bending. But the idea here with that whole sort of setup is they're saying that it might be more secure than an operating system. And that's where I wanted to bring it back here. It's like, okay, well, if you have a distributed database, and for our, our listeners, like this could be coming to you in the future. I've got, projects myself where this sounds sort of appealing for some of the things we're doing, like on large scale locking. How do you do that? I don't think we'll see it in where I am for the next several years, but we'll think about it. But like, this could come out to folks, and like, this is an open source project right now, so you can download it and play with it. how does that affect the security of both the applications you're building as well as the infrastructure and all these things we've been talking about today?
Yeah, my first reaction is just I love the aspect of getting rid of stuff you don't need. And already, we've got like Alpine Linux and the others that are just what's the smallest OS possible, because we don't have to deal with dependency scanning and update our dependencies, all that Vulns scanning that just wastes everybody's time for the most part. And this goes all the way to that other end of the spectrum. I think the only other comment that is my mind is taking this in right now, I love the idea on the small factor that like SQLite is the local database that embedded in all sorts of apps, because just having that, SQL-based querying, relational database is just useful for small clients. This is, as John was giving us a lot of the, terabytes of RAM and other details on, this is that much, much further end of the spectrum. And it seems really neat just to say TypeScript. We've got typing already. And I guess that's the other comment I'll make on it. I like something being built up that has a maturity of typing on it. And I guess so if I'm trying to be succinct and failing, getting rid of all the stuff you don't need and having a type-based system, two very nice properties that are appealing to my sense of secure design.
I thought that TypeScript part would sort of catch your interest.
I am resisting we've got JavaScript on the browser, now JavaScript on the server, now JavaScript running our databases. Who knows what else is next? But hey, at least it's a memory-safe language, right?
What do you guys think about how you would threat model something like this?
You're going to have to get experience with that database and sort of get an understanding of how it works and what its exposures are and what your use case is going to be. And are you going to connect this out to the internet and all those sort of standard things? And then I think it'd be sort of treated the way you treat an OS today. I think one of the benefits is you don't have to patch crazy amount of things on there. It should be a smaller, more concise thing. It's going to be interesting when you have to update that database, which hopefully they're going to be thinking about. Because one of the problems with these large-scale systems is when you want to do software updates, think about how do you patch 10,000 nodes. And yes, if you're cloud native, you just reboot them, but some folks don't do that for reasons. But yeah, I don't think I think it too much differently. How about you, Mike?
I think there would still be an angle of what data are you putting in there, and part of my threat modeling would be. Does this have sufficient access controls? Is it a KV store and all Ks and Vs are open to everyone, or can you have an equivalent of table field level access, row-based access, that type of thing, as well as encryption? So are you storing just encrypted blobs? Does it have the equality testing on deterministic encryption, that type of thing? Or is these just all opaque, you can't do any fuzzy searching, but you need to be storing encrypted data? So that's a little bit of just the threat modeling in the sense of what are we going to use this for? And I went to use cases that require more sensitive data handling as opposed to many other use cases that won't need that. So that's my answer of that's the way I would approach it depends, which all AppSec conversations boil down to at the end.
Fair enough.
While we're thinking, like you brought that up, Akira, because one of the things that another article is product security barking up the wrong tree. This comes from Mike Zalewski, who's well known within the security history of AppSec. Written some books, has done a lot of work there. So I'm setting that up so this isn't just a random blog post I've found on the internet, but it's talking about product security and barking up the wrong tree. And I thought it tied in quite well with our conversation with Tyler at the very beginning when he was saying, yeah, we start that cybersecurity program or we're doing enterprise security. Essentially, what is all of your endpoints, do they have an EDR on them? Do you have observability? Do you have strong authentication? A lot of these aspects before you even talk about AppSec. And this article is kind of pointing out a lot of vulnerabilities, a lot of the way that many organizations are breached, not necessarily through that classic web application front end. We're setting aside what VBA, the Verizon DBR looks like in their data set. So this is more of, as I'm stumbling through this, more of just that thought-provoking, how much should we care about product security or AppSec versus other things out there are more important?
I think like Tyler said earlier, there is the angle of needing product and application security, but you also must be compliant at the same time. And to further it with our conversation with Tyler, compliance is not security. So one thing I'd like to hear more of from this author is like an actual story of a timeline that they have worked on of like, here's what I did first, here's what I did second, and why I made those decisions. Because I agree, enterprise security is extraordinarily important. And like, you cannot discount AppSec, you cannot discount product security. I think it's so dependent, because it's my turn to say it depends, on the organization and the size of the org and what kind of like PII are you dealing with, what sort of regulation like HIPAA or something like that do you have to touch. So I would like to hear more stories about kind of the background of why this article was even written in the first place.
Interesting. I think part of it comes from that aspect of how are organizations being breached. For example, we've seen over the past couple years, if I can rattle them off correctly, Twitter at least, Discord, if I'm thinking correctly, and some others. But where I'm going with is, Slack tokens being compromised in some way or another, and then social engineering through those Slack tokens by actors getting in and saying, hey, can you reset this password? Oh, look, now I am the cloud administrator, and I'm going to take screenshots of the AWS or the GCP console where I could have clicked delete all, destroyed the entire org, if you will. And that's based on that idea of why wasn't there a FIDO2 keys backing this up? Or what are some countermeasures for that? I'll use zero trust in this segment as well, but that sense of, strong authentication of the endpoint, strong identity of the endpoint and the user as they're accessing services. So I think that's really what this is coming from, and how credential reuse is one of the easiest, most trivial ways into a system, into an org, as opposed to that cross-site scripting exploit that might look great on a bug bounty program or show up on whichever years of the OWASP top 10, but the risk and the impacts of it are definitely a lot different.
I think it comes down to, I think you can generalize a little further and say, what is that weakest link? Is it in the application? Is it in the infrastructure? Is it in the building? Back to, we were talking, I was asking Tyler earlier about like, is AppSec expensive? And if you want to go and be, I don't want to say crazy about it. If you want to be very detailed about it, yes, it requires a lot of customized experience and customized, tooling and working with the teams. But at the same time, where I'm going with this is I'm a big fan of sort of open-ended pen tests. Like, it doesn't matter where you take the attack, start looking for low-hanging fruit, right? So you might have a really great AppSec team, Akira, but if you've got the software which is running your loxes from some company which has a list of 10 vulnerabilities over on CMU's site, I'm going to start over there and then just go into physically a data center and take the damn server, right? It's where do you do that type of thing? Yeah, does that make sense? Or am I babbling?
Yeah, I guess like my next follow-up question, and we don't have to spend too much more time on this, is how do you know what is most important? Is it what's costing the company the most money? Is it where the vulnerabilities are more pronounced? Is it the human element? Like, is there like a checklist of maybe top 10 of things we should be looking out for in general for like
we're rubbing off
enterprise security, or are we going to be here all night talking about this topic?
So
I would say, this is, we've had multiple startups on here sort of talking about this. Like, you're asking really about like, how do you quantify and then prioritize risk? And there's all sorts of, not just startups, but like various different standards out there. Even CVSS has it to a small degree. Mike talked about zero trust. I can talk about CVSS. So it's, you have to have some way of doing that. As you get larger in scale, you have to have some way of doing this quantitatively. Otherwise, it really is, lick your finger, stick it in the wind, and like see which way it's blowing on a given day. And so you need to have something a little more concrete, I think, to go in that direction. Yeah.
Yeah. And Tyler, one final callback to that segment, Tyler talked about asset inventory, things like that. And in the show notes, have a link to a presentation from him where he talks about identify your crown jewels, have that, have an asset inventory, and then build that risk register. And that's one of those things that as an org becomes more mature, that's where that prioritization, I think, is going to come from, Akira, in terms of this is actually what we care about. These are the controls, and the controls aren't sufficient. The investment in controls. We're not going to make up some numbers for the sake of argument, $1 million on these controls to protect $10,000 worth of data. But if we have very valuable sensitive data or data that's covered by regulatory or other types of obligations, that becomes a lot more expensive, and the consequences of such. But I'm going to skip real quick to another way to answer that question, is that bug bounty programs, I do like them in the sense that they give you that quantification in dollars about the impact of vulnerabilities, because you're paying ostensibly on the impact of what that bug was. I have yet another article about blah, 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 how much an organization spent. Want to skip over that and point out, this is from Google. They were talking about Miracle Pointer, which we talked about earlier this year, back in January, I think. And they were pointing out that Miracle Pointer now is having an impact on the value of bounties they're paying out in Chrome. So this is the type of thing that is great to see Secure by Design work, addressing an underlying flaw, abusing use after free vulnerabilities. And they're reducing, they're attacking that class of vulns. So that was one quick thing I wanted to point out there. Don't know if you've got a comment on that, because we can also talk about Ghost Race, talking about how do we care about impactful things, or should we care, or how worried should we be about vulnerabilities like Ghost Race?
I'm going to let Akira be the tiebreaker on this one.
Yo, I kind of want to talk about Ghost Race, because
right, there we go.
Winner! Okay, let's see if we can cover this one quickly, because we're already sort of going along here. Ghost Race is sort of, I'd say, a little bit of a follow-up to Spectre, for those of you out there who might remember that, which was the big scary thing which came out 4 years ago. The idea being a modern CPU, Akira, does what's called speculative execution. So if you've got two if tests in like pick a language, really doesn't matter too much what, the compiler will set things up so while you're actually working on the first if test to see what's going on in there, it'll also, if that test becomes true or false, it'll run that in two separate CPU cores and see, okay, let's actually execute both passes of that logic, so that whichever one ends up being true, we've now got the answer. So it's an attempt to speed things up. The general problem that was going on with that is ain't no security concepts really around that within the CPUs up until the last year or so. So that allows you to see the result which is not being used would sometimes get left behind in cache, or you could use this sort of concept to manipulate and access other parts of memory. So in general, it was sort of a not great thing. What the folks over at VSEC have done here to sort of, oh, my camera's doing this again. Smart cameras are not smart people. But anyways, what the VSEC has done is figure out that let's go back and do a little more research around this type of thing. And in particular, if you think about synchronization primitives, so these are mutexes, spin locks, things like that. What they've done is they've gone through and they've looked at these, and in the Linux kernel, all these are actually based off of one way or another, some form of conditional logic. So in other words, if-then tests, which are the things which cause these problems, which we are trying to avoid in the first place. So they've gone through and done this on a few of these, and they have figured out that Linux on any modern CPU architecture, so ARM, x86, IBM, pick your poison, since this is actually based off software, this problem exists in all of them. So that's sort of at the core of what's going on here. And I'll shut up after saying there's two links which I put in to the show notes. So when we talked about this before, Mike, the main way to turn this stuff off was to, really disable speculative execution in your CPU, which is going to really kill performance. Yeah. Or do some things around locking in a very expensive way to do sort of thread locking and make sure that you can't have two different things accessing that part of memory. There's been a lot of really great research done since then. I put two white papers in there talking about how do we do this, either by maybe declaring certain parts of memory can't be used for speculative execution, or other tricks you can do with your CPU command set to try and get the same sort of effect without having a 40% overhead in performance.
And this is one of those things that I don't want to be overly dismissive of it, in the sense of how much do we care from an organization. It's like, should we start patching this? Should we be worried about this? If you're in a shared computing environment, that's where there's an exposure. That's your threat model. Mm-hmm. But for example, even with Spectre, there were some researchers from Google who demonstrated how to exploit Spectre through JavaScript. Which is really fun, and we have Rowhammer out there, a lot of these other things. But Kira, a little bit of callback to your question earlier. We don't have publicly known, we don't have any known avenues where Spectre was the breach, the way that organizations were compromised. Everyone out there getting hit by ransomware is because of lack of patching vulnerable systems. With known vulnerabilities. So go get those known vulnerabilities in that software that, patch has been available for many months. Do that first before you even start worrying about Ghost Race, and then start worrying about Ghost Race if it even applies to your environment. So I think that's kind of how it would, I love the write-up. I love the research, but just want to give that other angle of
come on, stop everything you're doing and patch.
I know, exactly. If this guy is falling, ghosts are everywhere. We'll have to save this. This 6 months, we'll have to save it for Halloween. We'll come back to this. But,
wait, I have a question before
yes.
we get too stuck, or before we end, actually. I have several questions. Actually,
you get one.
Trying to pick the best one. So, for our newer listeners, because I am the representative of all the babies of this industry, how do you know if something this dense and somewhat esoteric and very niche, as a new person, do you just rely on the people with more experience to be like, oh, this isn't important, or this is important? But you know what I mean? How do newer people understand this?
You're right. And it's not necessarily always that appeal to authority is a dangerous, path to go down. It's more of, in this case, I'd say, are you running in a shared computing environment? Do you have two different users on the same CPU, the same physical system, where they need those two tenants, those two users, absolutely need to be isolated, and one of them has the potential to be malicious. If that's the case, then start thinking about this. If that's not, then don't worry about these speculative execution types of attacks. In terms of prioritizing your security program investments, think about them from education, learning, reading more about it, because it is really cool research, and side channels are always, they're one of my favorite topics. So that's why I'm always going to play with them. So that's the it depends. And with that, thank you, Akira, for being our audience stand-in and asking those questions and helping us stay grounded and seeing through the ghosts that are out there of Ghost Race. Also want to thank John for walking us through all the news. Thank you all of our listeners for joining us. Please do subscribe, share on the socials, check out the show notes, and speaking of Ghost Race, check out Ghosts from Asilian. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.